Bliss and Grit is an entirely listener-supported show. Supporting us is also designed to support you through keeping the episodes rolling, but also through rewards for your donation, like a getting started guide, a private forum, and downloadable meditations. To become a supporting member, you can visit patreon.com/bliss and grit. Hello, beautifuls. You are listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Brooke Thomas, and I'll be joined soon by my dear friend and co-host, Vanessa Scotto. On the show, we are talking about being on the embodied spiritual path. And what does that actually mean? What is a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything, all the beauty and the crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life? Today, we are diving into the issue of spiritual bypass. And as I mentioned in the episode, I have beef with how common bypassing is held up as examples of what the spiritual path is, when in fact, it is in direct opposition to what the path is. As Dorothy Hunt says in her book, Ending the Search, spiritual concepts and spirit are not the same thing. It is the use of an idea of spirituality that keeps us unconscious. Or as Vanessa says, spiritual bypass is using the spiritual path to avoid our shit, usually while wearing the identifiers that we call the spiritual person. Now, of course, bypass is something that we all do to some degree or another as we walk this path, and I have done it plenty. So we're not trying to create vigilance against this thing called bypass, but having a good working understanding of what the path is and what bypass is, and that they are not at all the same thing, can help us to navigate in the direction of a deeply meaningful and transformative path, and to avoid some of the unconscious harm we can do towards ourselves and to the world when we're spiritually bypassing. So we've got beef, which was our funny ha-ha word for this episode. If you're enjoying the show, we would be delighted if you left a review on iTunes or on our Facebook page, which is Bliss and Grit. You can also go over to the website, blissandgrit.com, and subscribe to get our weekly digest of resources that we're loving, or become a supporting member at patreon.com/bliss and grit. Couple last things before we head into the conversation. Vanessa and I use potty mouth words sometimes, so if you're new here, heads up on that. And also, we are going to be off next week, so no new episode next Tuesday because we're taking some family time during Easter week. But we are back after that with a mot de mas, so it's going to be worth the wait. Okay, here we go. Hello, my beautiful.
Hello, darling Brooke.
I would love to talk about spiritual bypassing today.
I know you would.
Okay, so where to start? Recently, I had a dear and totally well-meaning friend send me an article about the difference between enlightenment and embodiment, because she knows that I work about, in the space about embodiment. It's a huge passion of mine. And the gist of the very short article was, and I'm completely paraphrasing it in my own wrecking ball way, meaning making it much more stark than it actually was. The gist of it was, we have to stop emphasizing in spiritual circles enlightenment, because enlightenment takes people, the idea of enlightenment is to take you up and away, to transcend your humanness. And we need to emphasize instead embodiment, because embodiment is about how do we come here and live this human life. And as you know, and as everyone listening knows, huge passion about how do we come here and live this human life. But my beef with this article was the author is using the word enlightenment to describe spiritual bypassing, not enlightenment, which enlightenment actually, first of all, one of the world's potentially the world's most corrupted word ever. But enlightenment is about landing right here in your life. And the spiritual path is about landing right here in your moment-to-moment life, truly being deeply, deeply, deeply intimate with it. And yet, I think we can all look in the out there world and see representations of ideas of the spiritual path all over the place that don't look like that. They don't look like meeting ourselves, meeting our lives, meeting whatever is up in any given moment. And it's because spiritual bypass is so common. We've come to define, the spiritual path is whatever your ideas are about it, transcending yourself, getting superpowers, super enlightenment powers, getting whatever. But actually that's just defining spiritual bypass. So, dear listener, if you're anything like literally every human being who does live and who has ever lived and who's on a spiritual path, you have probably engaged in bypass. Obviously, I'm including myself in that statement very much. So it's not necessarily a problem that it happens, because as we shed layers of our egoic conditioning, we will bypass, because we're trying to figure out how to do something that the ego doesn't know how to do. And if the ego is how we've been operating, it's quite a lot like trying to ride a bike a few feet and falling and messing up your shins. It's like, bypassed. And you catch yourself and whatever. But if we can have a working, clear definition and an understanding that it's incredibly common and that it's a misunderstanding of what we're doing here, meaning those of us who are on a path, then we can catch it more quickly and not go down a road. And I think we've all seen enough gurus behaving badly to know that that road oftentimes winds up in very harmful places. So all of that said, I have a couple of paragraphs here from the lovely Dorothy Hunt, who we just had on the show. And I thought she did a great job of defining spiritual bypass. So it's a whiff long for a quote, but since we didn't get into this in our conversation with her, I'll just bring her in via reading her book, which is titled Ending the Search, for those of you who are curious to check it out. Okay. Spiritual bypass is a term that describes using spiritual concepts, practices, or transcendence techniques to avoid facing difficult emotions, serious psychological issues, or actions that are based on separation, repression, and unconscious beliefs. Spiritual concepts and spirit are not the same thing. I would like to make clear that spirit bypasses nothing, since it is the essence of all. In fact, it is presence alone, being intimate with what is arising, that has the power to bring understanding and liberation to the experience at hand. It is the ego that wants to bypass what is uncomfortable seeing or feeling. While this may seem necessary at certain points, our true spirit clearly and unflinchingly sees what is before us or within us, but in the context of great compassion, acceptance, understanding, and love. It is the use of an idea of spirituality as a defense that supports our continuing unconsciousness. Blammo. Spiritual bypass. It's on.
I think we could probably take like 2 sentences and then talk about it.
I know, exactly.
2 sentences and then talk about it. I didn't tell you this before, but you may have heard me tell this story to you in a different way. First of all, I love that you use the word beef. It almost had me cracking up inappropriately. But I almost had a beef with Jeff Foster on Facebook, because this was maybe, I don't know, a year and a half ago or something. I didn't even know who Jeff Foster was. It was just, a lot of people liked him. He had started to come into the collective. And so I began following him, knowing next to nothing about the man. And he wrote something like, I'm not into enlightenment. I'm into enrealment, and it was all about like becoming, not lighter, but more human. Mm-hmm. And I almost wrote one of those smarty pants, like justify, like you just don't understand enlightenment,
Right. Let me tell you about my awesome idea that I call enlightenment.
Like all angry that like, as if I was defending the honor of the word, and all of the traditions that came behind the word. And And I think if we take Dorothy's words to heart, we understand that words suck. They're going to fail. And so a little bit, we can recognize that this word already has been corrupted. And if I was to project, I imagine that Jeff knows that.
Right.
And that when people read that word, what they think is lighten up. And I'm going to lighten up and away from this world of form. And he's taken it then and put a play on words to help people deepen into what their idea would be of having this awakening to your true nature. And words are a funny thing because they are just concepts. Sometimes like on social media, I'll post something on our Bliss and Grit page. And, for example, I posted a meme that said something like, you can't fix yourself because we're not broken. And then how people define broken can change. Well, I think we are broken and it's our resiliency that's beautiful, or, we're broken open, or life breaks us. Everyone can just use it differently. It's about what experience we're pointing towards and where the medicine is. So I think already we can preface this conversation with, our words are just concepts. Mm-hmm. Even that. And what we're aiming to bring forward is the energy of our experience and some facilitation that hopefully will invite everyone listening closer to their experience. Did what I say just make any?
Yeah. And I think really, really important frame.
Okay, great. So I first learned the term spiritual bypassing from my teacher, John Wellwood, who was the one who coined the term in the 80s. And it was quite simply like using the spiritual path or practices to avoid your shit, right? Like you don't want to feel feelings. You don't want to have issues. You don't want to be a person with challenges. You want to see yourself as ever good, ever compassionate, ever wonderful. You want to arrive in that state of nirvana where there is no pain and no changeability and no mystery and no fear. And I was like, yeah, that's my resting place, is in the dream of spiritual bypass, I was like poster child for wanting that, especially at the age where I found him, which was, I don't know, probably 28-ish, give or take a couple of years. And y'all have heard me talk about it before, probably. And I mentioned it to Dorothy last week. I was poster child for imagining that if I meditated and if I read Buddhist wisdom and sat with teachers, that eventually and inevitably I just might be able to rise above the human fray and land in a perfectly placid Zen state in which I was always calm, always happy, always giving, and quite frankly, probably always pretty, like frozen and Guan Yin.
Floating on a cloud in an amazing dress.
Gorgeous. And I'm just looking peaceful. It's like when you do tantric Buddhist meditation, you will visualize the deities in front of you, the embodiment of these streams of energy. And so when you do these Buddhist practices, you would visualize the goddess Tara, and she is beautiful. She's beautiful. That's what they say. They give a description of how beautiful she is. And so it's like, great, freeze frame. I'm like Tara, all giving, all compassionate. I never have a need, so I can never be disappointed. And I'm frozen as a beautiful young being. So anyway, that was me. And it was a gradual process of reality presenting itself to me that that's not the way it goes. And it happened through multiple disillusionments in life. Divorce, probably one of my first bigger ones. Friendships falling apart. Health changing, feelings that you expected were long gone, resurfacing, like oh, there are those suicidal impulses again. And I'm like 40 something and I've done all of this work. How could they possibly still be there? And that sense that, I've just been managing all of this, and that my will comes to a point where it ends and I'm not in control. And that even as I awaken to truth, there's still this level of mystery. There's still this human experience of having a body and all of the conditions that come with it. So it's been such a gradual process to land at a place where even that word wasn't a concept, just another concept to use and go, oh, well, I got some spiritual bypassing. I guess I shouldn't be spiritual bypassing. Now, how am I going to control my spiritual bypassing tendencies?
Right. Yeah.
And land where, oh, that's the movement. Oh, isn't that fascinating? What's that movement hooked into? Feel what it's like when that releases, this actual closeness with the part of myself that so innocently grasped to move away from what it found intolerable and overwhelming.
I'm thinking about when I first started working with Kieran, doing one-on-one work. And it's so funny to look back and see like what were the concepts I was operating under about what I was doing when I, started working with her as a client. And it's really funny. So it was directly after we finished our first week at Dharma Ocean, the Meditating with the Body program. It was after we finished the entire program. That's right. Because I started working with her in April. We finished in February. And when we were in that program, we had 5 months of support in the form of a meditation teacher and a small group. And I really liked my meditation teacher and having someone to check in with, just to say, yes, I'm meditating. And these are the experiences that are happening in my life. So something different from therapy, but about kind of being with another person in tracking this unfolding process. And so, as the divine would have it, I stumbled along Kieran's work and realized she was still taking on individual clients. And I was like, oh, great, I'll work with her as sort of my meditation instructor. But instead of her teaching me to meditate or me being accountable, like, yes, I did my meditation. No, I didn't do my meditation. I can also bring up some of the like sticky stuff that you would talk about with a coach, like money issues and, some work project fell apart and blah, blah, blah. And conceptually, I really had it as this separate thing. Like, oh, isn't it great? I found this spiritual person who I can have some of that conversation with. And then over here on the other side of my life, I'll be doing my Dharma Ocean meditation practices. And they were in these very neat containers. And then I worked with Kieran for years or 2 years. I can't remember, something like that. And it was about the process of having somebody who understood a life beyond separation of concepts of separation and separate self, where I could bring up whatever was happening in my actual life and meet it with this deep intimacy, really, really touch it, not run away, not turn away, not in a like, look at it, holding your face in the dirt, but like just suddenly there was this large spaciousness within a meeting with another person who got it to go, oh, okay, I can look and see it. And it really wasn't until like maybe a year into working with her when I was on retreat with her where I had a big realization. And I realized, like, I remember the thought I had was like, oh my God, what most people want and what I wanted from the spiritual path is bypass. I wanted, like the words, I wanted the spiritual identifiers, and we can all see everyone has different spiritual identifiers. Like in my case, I practice in this lineage and I didn't go this route, but there was the potential to say, I've taken my Bodhisattva vow and I have done my, Mahayana course and I've gone to the, blah, blah, blah. And I kind of wanted to progress the way you would progress through grad school and to be able to wear those identifiers, like look at what level I've achieved and what long words I know. And, I'm the kind of person who meditates twice a day. I'm the kind of person who, travels to Crestone and does silent meditation for a week. And we can see other identifiers in people. I'm the kind of person who wears crystal jewelry and goes to Wanderlust. I'm the kind of person who, says namaste at the end of every conversation. I'm the kind of person who gives people the big, bright, unblinking love and light eyes whenever they look at me. And like on some levels, these things aren't are we saying the rule is don't meditate twice a day? Don't wear crystal jewelry? Don't whatever? Like, no, but we have to understand when we're wearing a Halloween costume called spiritual person versus when we're actually on the path. So for me, it was quite surprising to discover, oh my God, this work that I've been doing with this teacher, where I just meet my actual life and whatever is most deeply, agitatingly, intimately, painfully arising in any given moment, that's the spiritual path. I had no idea that deeply and intimately meeting the contents of my actual lived experience was a spiritual path, because I had the idea of the Halloween costume I was going to wear and that it was going to give me certain prizes, better person, calmer person, nicer person, blah, blah. So I think in some ways just describing, like, pointing at exactly what we're saying the spiritual path is, which can only be lived. So again, it's also just a concept, but in the way that we're talking about it here and it's being heard, but like deeply meeting your life doesn't matter the Sanskrit words, doesn't matter the outfits you wear, doesn't matter the kind of company you keep, the number of retreats you go on annually, doesn't matter. If you are called to do those things, do. But they're not the point. They're pointers.
My brain, I had so much like bubbling while you were speaking, and then
and then I just dropped off a cliff.
No, sadly, in the end, where my brain landed, and whatever comes out of my mouth next is always where my brain lands when you're done speaking. So it's like thoughts come through, but then it's like whatever's like the next one up is what comes out of my mouth. And sadly, where my brain ended was on the documentary Wild Wild Country that's about Osho. Have you heard of it yet?
Oh, I did. I haven't seen it, but I've vaguely heard talk. Yeah, it was about Osho.
It's okay. Very interesting. So it's about Osho and when he came to America and with his whole community. I'm only a couple of episodes in, but it's interesting for a couple of reasons. One, they all have to wear orange for some reason. They never get at that. Osho doesn't, but the people in the group. And to me, I was like, see, this is one of those things that it's so beautiful that consciousness is beginning to allow it to fall away, that the path doesn't have to do with the signifiers. Perhaps at some point, it is supportive of our ego mind in order to step out of what we've associated so strongly with in our life, whatever that is, whatever identity, whatever belief systems that are so concretized in form. And so perhaps things like being at an ashram in India might be necessary for that step, or wearing a certain color. I don't even know why they did it. Maybe there's an energy field. I have no idea. And yet eventually it all falls away. And I do believe the tides are moving so that it's falling away collectively as well as we're recommending it individually. The other thing that's interesting is they got footage of what's called an encounter group, which is part of what Osho's style recommended. But it was a popular psychological movement in America to do these encounter groups, which was a kind of group therapy, very primally oriented to meet your emotions. When you see it, it is really scary looking. And so what I got when I was observing that, having been through a lot of different kinds of group therapies, et cetera, and being on this path for so long in my life, is even that is interesting, because the concept was that in order to awaken to your true nature, you have to begin to see and release everything that's unenlightening you, right? All of the energies we can store in our body, all of the conditioning we can have in our mind and in our systems. And during that time, they thought primal therapy, screaming, fucking, like aggression. They didn't care. It was like, get it out, get it out. And even that is not wholly appropriate for every person in every moment and can become another bypass. And the wild thing that you watch is how any teaching can become a bypass. Mm-hmm. And we can become, let's say in that example, and in so many examples, hooked on our emotions. So that when we hear, for example, meet your emotions, get close to them, meet them intimately, even that can be taken by our ego mind to give space for my emotions. My emotions are very important. I must express them.
And they're going to be big, and then they're big and they're being vomited and I don't care and caution to the wind.
And then we're upset when people won't be with them because we don't know why, because we expect this is right. So everything can be taken. And this is why I'm getting closer and closer to this idea for myself where I'm like, no wonder you needed to have a direct relationship with somebody who's embodying these things, because groups serve. I mean, people listening, you guys write us letters. I know that it serves just to hear and connect and be in the presence of, and storytelling serves. But ultimately, when it comes to direct experience and refining on our own path, the wisdom and discernment of, is this my ego grabbing something? Mm-hmm. Or is this a natural unfoldment? It can be quite a subtle process. And in group teachings, it is so rapid that our ego takes hold of something, takes ownership of something, and then actually keeps us along the course of spiritual bypass, where it keeps us moving away from what's the most difficult, mucky, hard for us to sit with stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I was on a one-day event recently. So, everyone's in the breaks, like introducing themselves, talking, and, in other scenarios, like let's say it was some kind of workshop or lecture series, people would do what's your name? Where are you from? What brings you here? But in these situations, I've seen it over and over again, and it happened here too. They want your spiritual resume, and they want to show you their spiritual resume. I was with my teacher, and I did that for 20 years, and now I'm here, and and then some long Sanskrit word, and how about you? What's your lineage? What movements are you in? And I'm like, It's just like, I don't know. I don't answer that question. And I can appreciate it. And I think that like anything, there's a place for these things, right? Because there is at core a heart's calling towards what we would describe the spiritual path. And I think that early on, it looks like the kinds of things that are spiritual concepts. Because if we're living our whole life from concepts unknowingly, then of course, like the concept that I'm going to meditate twice a day and it's going to get me to somewhere better than here. The concept that I'm going to go on that retreat with that teacher, they're concepts, but they're also callings. And so we can be, affectionate with ourselves, because certainly I have been that person too, where it was exciting for me to be a part of a certain, kind of group and to be able to sit around and we can all quote Pema Chodron and we can all quote Reggie Ray and we can all laugh about that awesome, chapter in a book or episode of a podcast or whatever. And it feels, delightful. And I think that there's an intelligence to that too, right? Like it gets you in the right place. And, So the desire of it isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just that at a certain point we have to see, like, are we wearing the Halloween costume? Are we all wearing the same Halloween costume at this party? And if we are, what are we doing with ourselves and with each other? What kinds of conversations are we having? Because what you'll notice is that they're the kinds of conversations that take us to the magical land called over there. You know, over there, when I attain enlightenment, or when I, finish that retreat, or whatever, wear the orange clothing. I don't know. Then I will be, and the presumption is a higher, better, more virtuous, more pure, more amazing version of myself. And that's the mythology of enlightenment, because really the only place we can ever go with any of these things is back to the life we're living. But hopefully with more intimacy and fewer concepts. And that's something that loosens over time. So we also don't need to do what the ego is going to want to do, which is to berate ourselves for not just letting it, do its thing, not perfectly intimately meeting every moment of our lives and having a thought, God forbid, oh, I had a thought, oh, I had a concept, oh, I misunderstood. Oh, all of my newest friends are on spiritual path who have the same teacher as me. Like, we don't need to berate ourselves either. So we get to be intimate even with that. Like, in those moments when we see it, like, well, why? What is it for? What is the desire underneath this, really?
I found a lot of softening reading Amoda Ma's book, which is Embodied Enlightenment, right? Am I remembering the title right? Okay. Yeah. And we're going to be having a conversation with her next week. So,
oh my God, so excited. Loved that book.
We're 2 weeks. Very exciting. I don't know exactly how she said it, but I'll tell you how I took it. So something to the effect of, as long as we have a mind body, we'll have an ego. Mm-hmm. And it's just part of it, like how a mind body has connective tissue and a brain and bones, it has an ego, and the ego is important. It's how I differentiate that there is an outside world and there is an inside world, which, even though the separate self is not real the way we think it is, it's very helpful to navigate a world of form, right, knowing this is my body and that is something other than my body.
Yes.
And so it comes like built in by the manufacturer into this body. So you're not ditching it at any point. I found the whole thing so relieving and delicious, because I'm like, oh God, we spend all this time, trying to transcend the ego, and then hating the ego, and then judging the ego if we're in really cool spiritual circles. And then we're like, okay, I'm going to befriend the ego, but I'm only doing it to get it to go away. I'm just trying to kill it nicely, and
right. Yeah.
All of these different things. And, if you just can have this really soft openness for the human condition and be like, oh my God, of course, I'm a being in a body. And if I have a body, I have an ego. And if I have an ego, I have conditioning, and I will try to bypass from time to time. No big deal. We are all okay, because, as Dorothy pointed to, the spirit, always with truth, never bypassing. So really, what's the problem? The only problem is the part of us that doesn't want to be suffering anymore. And so it's like, I want to be done with all the things that are standing in my way of experiencing more ease and more peace and more happiness. And so if these teachers are telling me bypassing's in the way, then let's be done with that.
Right.
And we just desperately want the rule, the approach, or the methodology to be done with our suffering. So that's part of having a body mind too.
Yeah.
So that's also no big deal. But in reality, we can be soft about this approach. It's almost like, you know, that teaching where they talk about grasping and attachment, and they'll like illustrate, put your hand out and you put a rock in your hand and like you grip a fist, and that's attachment. But that to approach life from a softer place, you can have that same object in your hand, but have your palm open, and you're still carrying it, but it's open. I feel like it's a profound teaching even for how we meet concept. It's like, we're going to have it. And these pointers that we get from all of these beloved sources of wisdom, they're beautiful, but even they cannot be gripped onto as reality. Only reality is reality.
Right.
And the wonderful thing is reality is always happening. So if you missed it this moment, you always have the next one. It is not a problem. What I think could be additionally helpful here, Brooke, see what you think, is let's talk about why we care about spiritual bypassing and having this conversation, because it's not to say, oh, some people are spiritual bypassing. Like,
look at you with your feather earrings and your crystal jewelry. Tisk, tisk.
How dare you, you know, or to make it into a problem. Like, we're not trying to create a hypervigilance. Why are we having this conversation?
Yeah. Yeah. For me, the reason why it's so, passionate is because what the spiritual path or spiritual unfolding actually is, you know, very tenderly and genuinely meeting our alive life as it unfolds in any given moment. It doesn't guarantee the caricature we have in our minds of the enlightened person who's above it all and blah, blah, blah. But what it does do, if it's really lived and practiced imperfectly, as it inevitably will be, it does free us from so much of what causes suffering to ourselves internally and what causes suffering, us to cause suffering in the world. Oftentimes, really totally unconsciously, we're creating harm in the world and we're creating violence in the world. When we believe concepts and act them out and impose them on ourselves and impose them on the world. And so my heart breaks extra much because the possibility for a real spiritual path is to have a deeply human life that is much looser in its concepts, which means we're just not going to inflict as much harm on ourselves or on others. And when we define the spiritual path as a bypass, which is much of what happens, this beautiful treasure winds up creating another tool of violence. And that's really heartbreaking to see. And so I think it's really important to differentiate these things, you know, like, so when people say, like in this article, you know, spiritual people who are seeking enlightenment are causing great harm in the world because they are planning on, or convinced they have transcended the world. That in and of itself is a harmful statement, because you're giving people the concept that spiritual people are those awful ones that are abandoning the pain and the suffering in the world for their own treatsies of transcendence, you know? That's not true. What that is describing is bypass. And so the more that we can all have a working knowledge of what it means to be on an unfolding path, and that it has literally nothing to do with being a part of some particular spiritual group, teacher, knowing any kinds of Sanskrit words or anything. It's really just about meeting your intimate life. Then the world actually can change, because it's an inside job, each of us as individuals, really inhabiting ourselves, not turning away from ourselves, not making ourselves and others into objects. when that happens, there is the possibility that that is a really radical, powerful, and loving activism towards the world. But as long as we hold up the spiritual path as the Halloween costume called spiritual path, it's not accessible for people. People can't live it. People can't walk it, and they can't engage with it. And they're just creating more harm.
It's funny because that article is also coming from a place of concept because the person clearly hasn't had the experience.
Right. So it's this duality. Oh, enlightened people or spiritual people are like this. Embodied people are like this. It's like, no, it's all the same.
Right. And so it's a painting of this very common pattern we can get stuck in that duality because, of course, even in most traditions, enlightenment traditions, mystical traditions where that's a part of it, what we'll see is that as people awaken, they naturally show up in service.
Yeah.
So it's a very
towards
interesting
the suffering of the world when you have capacity for it.
Mm-hmm. So they're talking about a conceptual reality or perhaps a lived experience, but misidentifying it.
Exactly.
In other words, you can notice that some people have a tendency to want to be up and away. Mm-hmm. And you can feel in yourself that's not quite where the sauce is at. But you may not have the words for it. I'm going to butcher a story right now. And I butchered this to you on Saturday, Brooks. I'm going to repeat my butchered story, but it's what's coming up. And it is a little snippet of what Amoda Ma said in her second interview on the Buddha at the Gas Pump podcast, which we will have all of this in our resources. So the person interviewing her was getting at, is the universe a benevolent place? So any of you who've been listening to us may have heard us make reference to like life can be very loving and life can have benevolence. And, this is a spoken about experience that's common enough. So he was getting at, well, and isn't the world actually a benevolent place and that it does things for you as a way to begin to recontextualize what so often we can feel. The world is so hard. Life is hard. I'm being punished. So he was offering that forward. And she said, well, I prefer not to give any concept. I prefer to abandon all duality, that the world is either a very hard place or that the world is a benevolent place, but rather see what happens when you sit with all of that concept falling away and you just land with, this is life. And how does that arise as you meet that? Like, what if you were just to sit with, life is neither good nor bad, it's life? What would happen as that arises? And the part that I will butcher is she goes on to talk about something else. I think an example of how suffering can arise as sort of an invitation to get closer to the experience of, this is life. And Rick says, well, almost by inference, by using that example, you're pointing towards it being a benevolent universe. Like it delivers you what you need to land in that experience. And she's like, yes, it ultimately ends there. But if you say that before someone's ready, they just hold on to the concept. And that can be to the detriment of having the experience. So for example, people who may feel very invested in the positivity movement or love and light, as you used before, being reality and everything's good and it's benevolent and, everything's working for my higher good. What can happen is that can be a concept, yes, but it can be overlaying an experience that's very different for the person. There could be fear that that's not true, fear that they're not worthy, fear that they aren't already love, fear that they're undeserving. All sorts of things can be happening on the deeper level. And we can then sort of be pasting the concept over it and then desperately trying to cling to the concept and giving ourselves mantras and visuals and practices. Yet deep down, there's no lived experience of that. So it doesn't really let go. It doesn't settle. It's not embodied, if we want to use that term. And so then, in fact, that concept becomes what you were saying, violence. Like it can become a kind of harm. I don't want to mean that it's like intentionally inflicted upon ourselves. It's not that, but it can keep us away from what our spirit is actually pointing us to.
Yeah.
Which is the lived understanding of what it's like to be with stillness and truth and love. And so even beautiful words can at some point be really helpful and then at some point become a hindrance. Like, you know that, forget it, I was going to give you a parable and then I realized maybe it's not related to what I'm saying.
Well, when I listen to you speak, like what I'm thinking about, what I'm picturing. So I think all of us listening, I know for sure me, we can all think of that one thing, the most painful thing, you know, the thing that has been the deepest agony in our lives, right? We all have one. That's just caused us immense suffering and grief and regret and shame and despair and all of the gnarlier emotions. So we can all conjure up and know that we have that, right? And so if I were to take my experience of that, you can see how compelling it would be at some point just to say, well, this feels like I want to die, but it's an invitation, it must be an invitation from God that is loving, right? Or source or whatever word you want to use. So that's a concept, right? And if I really invest in that concept, what happens is it creates this hard shell around the actual experience, around the actual memories, but really more just the visceral emotions of it. And what that hard shell does is it holds it in place. And so I'm constantly split. There's this awful, awful, sickening ache in me about this particular experience. And this really exhausting belief system that I'm trying to run over it, which is like, well, it must be loving because it's here and there's nothing that's not God.
It that way.
Right, I know. If there's nothing that's not God, it's good news too. But if instead we find that we can't, Pema Chodron wrote that great book, The Wisdom of No Escape. If we're lucky/unlucky, something comes along in our individual lives that we can't escape because it won't leave us alone because it's that painful. Or if you're a lucky person with lighter karmic conditioning, it's not necessarily that painful. It's just you're more available for it to give you an illuminating moment, right? God bless. I love you. Man, hope I incarnate as one of y'all next time. But if you're somebody like me who has more wiring towards suffering, then that has to be met. And by met, what that means is all the things, whatever it looks like. You know, we can't make up ideas about that either. Oh, well, this means I'm going to have grief for 8 years. I don't know. Maybe it'll be 8 minutes. I don't know. We don't know until we actually let ourselves experience it. And we get all the support that we need, whatever shows up for us that's really there and real, whether it's trauma therapy, a spiritual teacher, a beloved friend, we don't know. But like to actually touch it, you'll at some point as you heal, maybe have an experience of like, wow, that was the worst thing ever. I would never wish that on myself or on anyone else. What I notice is it was a extremely powerful alchemical agent. I will never be the same. I can never go back to the person I was before this thing. I can't. There was a death that occurred. But I noticed that this new place I've entered by really sitting with that alchemical agent, pretty good place. Like I see things from a vantage point that's just much more compassionate, much broader, much more expansive, you know, but that is a journey that we all undertake as individuals. And so people can be there for us in loving support and in tenderness. and people can point us along the way and give us tools to work with, but nobody can hand you like, got it, checkbox. If everything is God, it must be love. We have to do the thing.
Very disappointing thing about reality for me. I'm like,
yeah, you don't get to skip. You don't,
like, and teachers can't just give you an answer. And like, even when you speak to like psychics and people who speak to angels and clairvoyants and all these people, like, yeah, they're all pointing at things and they're useful. And yet it doesn't seem to get you out of the whole have to do it yourself part anyway, you know, energy work. It's all like beautiful and helpful. And I've had some profound openings. It's just none of it ever gets you out of still having to
live your own life.
Your life, you know, and that was a real bummer at some point in my revelation that this is what happens. You know, we had a listener write to us on our Patreon page saying, can you please speak about paradox? And I was thinking, like, have we not done an episode on paradox? Because I suppose it's that everything we speak about literally has paradox in it. And that is the confounding but natural part of spiritual teachings. And so I'm about to kick it on the paradox thing because concepts are important and unimportant. You know, they are relevant and have to be held lightly. So, for example, many of us have not been shown how to have a healthy relationship. And so we become quite beautifully and lovingly curious about, well, what would a healthy relationship look like? Right? I mean, honest to God, I don't know. How would one communicate? What amount of needs are appropriate? When am I asking too much? How much do you share? Do you cry or don't you cry to people? Like, what is it that healthy people do? And that's a really tender and natural place. And it can feel healing and helpful to have someone speak from a place of experience about how they interact in relationship, about what they've seen, about what they've come to learn is a movement of health. And yet, it's also personal and nuanced that even as you get that conceptual guidance of here's what I think healthy relationships like, and here's what I suspect is coming up for you and for them, and how you're crashing against each other. Even with all of that, sometimes being very helpful and just quite frankly healing, because there's a part of us that was always seeking support and never had anybody attuned to us that way. Even that runs dry, because what is required is that we live in our beings in relationship, and we get curious about all the subtle fluctuations and where our movements come from. So, for example, I had this idea for an episode that was differentiating giving from sacrificing. So let's say, for example, an act of kindness or generosity, I don't know, maybe I'm going to bake a friend cookies because they're having a tough day. That action, which can be considered very healthy in relationship, very loving, very kind, could be born of a place of, I have to do this so that people like me. In which case, it's not defining what we would hope for ourselves, which is to be genuine and to know that we're loved. But that same act can arise from a movement of giving, just this natural bubbling over of, oh, I love you. Let me show you something. Let me offer you something. So no amount of concept can ever fill in the blanks for you to have a closer relationship to what's arising, what's moving you, where's it coming from? What kind of thoughts are sort of hijacking your actions? And that's how we truly begin to embody it. And I think that's just a metaphor for the same is true with our unfolding in every aspect of our being. So in the part of us that says, like you and I, Brooke, to Kieran so tenderly a couple of years back, but like, how do I know my true nature more? Right. Like we didn't say it like that, but it comes through.
That was certainly,
somehow.
Yes, what was being communicated.
Dear mama figure Kieran, please help me understand how not to be herdy all the time.
And get it right, because that was the ego agenda. How do I do life right?
Yeah. As we're asking that. And it was so helpful. I mean, her pointings, even sometimes her teachings and her concepts, I share them here sometimes, the difference between management and transformation and, forgiveness as a concept. These things are all wonderful pointings and they can feel nourishing and helpful. And even still, at some point, like the Buddha who sat under the Bodhi tree, or like Christ who sat in the desert, we all have to just meet the alive rawness of our experience and hold these concepts lightly.
Thank you so much for listening to today's show. The show notes, including any resources we mentioned, live at blissandgrit.com. And our member platform is at patreon.com/blissandgrit, where you can donate to the show and also get more community support. So if you're wanting to engage with these topics in a deeper way, that's a good place to go. Thank you so much to everyone over at Patreon already. We're loving getting a chance to talk with you all more. And needless to say, we are super grateful for the financial support, which keeps the show ad-free and gives us some time to devote to it and helps us pay our awesome producer, Tom. You can also come hang out with us on Instagram and Facebook or subscribe to the website, which is blissandgrit.com. We send out a Friday digest. Thank you for the reviews, the membership support, and all the notes you send. This week on our episode with Dorothy Hunt, Sabine left the comment, that was a good discussion. There was a faint beep at certain points. It reminded me of the sound of a submarine descending, and every time I heard it, I said to myself, oh, we're going to go deeper. Beautiful. Well, we very much loved having that conversation with Dorothy, so we're delighted that it was useful and yummy for you too. And we also love that you made some audio hiccups into an important audio metaphor. Thank you, Sabine. We'll be back next week.